осіб задихається від лівацького гівна. Суспільство божеволює від наказ, хворих, злочинів, антипали на тети генерацій та сепаратизму. Наші ворог намагається зруйнувати судову, європейську культуру і історію. Звідки беруть коріння наші предки, воїни. Ми, українські націоналісти, попереджуємо. Ми не дозволимо розповсюджуватися цій раковій поплині на нашій землі. Ми допоможемо нашим соратникам та ідейним братам в світовій боротьбі. Ми готові! Слава Україні! Героям слава!
As tensions between Russia and Ukraine reach another zenith, the worrying question of Ukraine's far-right movement and its political significance reemerges on the foreground. The question is as old as the war in the Donbass region itself, given the formation of numerous fascist and neo-Nazi paramilitary units at the very outset of the conflict. Unsurprisingly, few of the narratives regarding the specter of fascism in Ukraine are able to capture the reality and gravity of the situation. Though the Russians have been diligent in pointing out the alarming presence of far-right groups in the highest circles of Ukrainian politics, the motive coming from the Kremlin has been less than sincere. Rendering all anti-Russian voices as fascist comes with very predictable political bonuses, both domestically and abroad. This version of the story not only legitimizes Russia's involvement in the crisis, but effectively undermines the legitimacy of Ukraine's efforts to secure a basic degree of sovereignty. The narrative in Kyiv is not any better. Ukraine's political elite has moved from denial to false assurances that the problem has been resolved. Interestingly enough, the obfuscation is so strong that it makes a claim ironically parallel to Moscow's. The fascists are in fact patriots fighting for Ukrainian independence. Actual fascists and neo-Nazis are given state resources to conduct patriotic activities, mobilize younger generations, and maintain clandestine pressure on political opposition. The geopolitical implications of Ukraine's future are demonstrably significant. But how this future will shape the role of the far right, and how the far right will, in turn, shape the future of the country is potentially more important. The precedent the situation in Ukraine could set for a burgeoning radical right may produce disastrous ripple effects across the world. The genealogy of the Ukrainian far right warrants an investigation of its own. There is a long history of fascist, radical nationalist, and pro-Nazi movements, especially in the western provinces of the country. Undoubtedly, every aspect of this history contributes to the state of far-right activity in present-day Ukraine. Historical figures and organizations play a crucial role in the political legitimation of contemporary far-right movements. This is often coupled with the alarming trend of rehabilitating some of the most problematic figures in Ukraine's nationalist past. Perhaps the most influential of the rehabilitated fascist movements is the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. Some voices in Ukraine have attempted to present the OUN as a national liberation group, fighting for Ukrainian sovereignty above all other principles. This, however, is strikingly insincere. As historian Per Anders Rudling writes, from the moment of its founding, fascists were integral to and played a central role in the organization. The OUN avoided designating itself as fascist in order to emphasize the originality of Ukrainian nationalism. In 1941, the organization split between a more radical wing, the OUN-B, named after its leader Stepan Bandera, and a more conservative wing, the OUN-M, led by Andriy Melnik. Both were totalitarian, anti-Semitic, and fascist. In terms of tactics, the OUN-M was more cautious and stayed loyal to Nazi Germany throughout the war, whereas the OUN-B took a more independent line. The OUN-M was a smaller and weaker organization, and plays a minor role in the nationalist myth-making today. In the years leading up to World War II, the OUN's primary focus was carrying out terrorist attacks. Operating primarily in western Ukraine, which at the time was under Polish rule, the organization targeted Polish political figures in a persistent terror campaign. The OUN maintained close relations with other fascist and far-right groups across Europe, from the Phalangists in Spain to the Ustaše in Croatia. Most importantly, the OUN proclaimed a strong affinity for Nazi Germany. It was on the basis of these warm relations that the OUN joined forces with the armies of the Third Reich during World War II. The OUN and its military wing, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, were notorious killers, well known for perpetrating countless ethnic cleansings in Ukraine and Belarus. Roman Shukhevych, who was posthumously awarded the status of national hero by the president of Ukraine in 2007, went on to be a high-ranking officer in the Nazi army, personally responsible for many atrocities of the Holocaust. Rehabilitation of these freedom fighters continues to this day. In March of 2021, a stadium in the city of Ternopil was named after Stepan Bandera and Shukhevych, causing outrage in many communities who were rightfully shocked by the brazen endorsement. Bandera and others from the OUN are repeatedly framed by the far right as freedom fighters who fought neither for the Nazis nor the Soviets. Indeed, the celebration of Nazis and fascists in Ukraine is commonly masqueraded as a trendy exercise in rebuking the communist past, which has in large part been driven by government efforts to reinvent the nation's history. Ukraine suffered from many of the same afflictions as the post-Soviet republics in the wake of the Eastern Bloc's collapse. As the country was plundered by a ring of rising oligarchs, the roots of corruption, organized crime, and economic precarity dug deep into Ukrainian soil. The fundamental question of geopolitical orientation loomed over the country as it did over many of its neighbors. Was Ukraine's future with Moscow or with the West? In reality, the very posing of this question locked the country into a doomed fate, stuck between the prospects of being a low rung in one of two hegemonic spheres, all while suffering from a continued looting courtesy of the indubitably patriotic domestic elite. For Russia, a Western-aligned Ukraine was, and will likely always be, completely unacceptable. NATO's encroachment towards Moscow had already reached Russia's borders before the crisis in Ukraine began. The potential addition of Ukraine, Russia's largest contiguous neighbor to the West, would present a liability that the Kremlin would never want to afford. Conversely, Ukraine is little more than a means to an end for the West. Far from being concerned about the well-being of ordinary Ukrainians, the game for Washington and its allies is ultimately about applying persistent pressure on Russia, who exerts an uneasy level of influence over Europe with its vast exports of energy resources. Ukraine's political elite consists almost entirely of a circle of oligarchs, among whom there have always been pro-Russian and pro-European flavors. Thus, the long-standing conflict between the East and the West is played out not along inter-class dynamics, but intra-class dynamics. The false dichotomy between Moscow and Europe is perpetuated entirely by the fact that the representatives of Ukrainian capital are themselves only interested in those two options. Caught between these complex dynamics, the very legitimate question of the Ukrainian people's self-determination is contorted to fit anyone's interests except for those of the Ukrainian people themselves. In this sense, the far right offers Ukraine a uniquely independent vision, one that is almost as hostile to Western influence as it is to the tendrils of the Kremlin. The absence of a left-wing alternative to this dilemma only serves to amplify the allure of fascist and neo-Nazi ideology. Ukraine's ongoing project of decommunization is therefore not only a concerted effort to rewrite history, but also a political evisceration that creates space for fascist narratives to dominate alternative discourses. The far right is responsive to this reality, consciously or otherwise. Its proponents regularly proclaim a disdain even for those oligarchs and politicians who have thrown their weight behind the anti-Russian narrative. Indeed, few of the dominant far-right organizations offer anything other than begrudging tolerance for the establishment. The Orange Revolution of 2004 became the first condensation of contradictions in post-Soviet Ukraine. However, even with the ascension of the pro-West Viktor Yushchenko, the underlying tensions splitting the country in half were not resolved. The pro-Russian East squared off with the historically pro-European West. Ukraine's attempt to re-envision its national history resulted in what pro-Russian groups perceived to be a direct attack on the Russian-speaking population. With these changes came the rewriting of history itself, including the infamous rehabilitation of fascists. The second eruption was the Euromaidan revolution in 2014, in which pro-Russian President Yanukovych was ousted after a series of earth-shattering protests. Ukraine found itself once again faced with the false dichotomy of the West and Russia. It was with the victory of the pro-European camp that the contemporary far right in Ukraine finally found access to legitimate channels of power. During the time of the Maidan protests, the far right existed primarily as circles of street thugs, football hooligans, and fringe political parties. Many of the most prominent fascist, ultranationalist, and neo-Nazi groups can trace their lineage back to the world of street gangs. Displays by a part of the Maidan protesters of neo-Nazi symbols such as swastikas, SS signs, the Celtic Cross, and the 1488 sign, referring to a white supremacist statement and Heil Hitler, in different Maidan-controlled areas also indicated presence and toleration of members of neo-Nazi organizations, groups, or their sympathizers among the protesters. The far right thrived in the exceptionally violent environment of the Euromaidan, establishing a solid foothold in the political atmosphere emerging from the conflicts. The influence of such far-right organizations as the Right Sector and its members such as Trizub, UNA, UNSO, and the Patriot of Ukraine far exceeded their relatively small membership during the Euromaidan because they were paramilitary organizations and relied on violence. Many of their leaders and members had training in use of violence, including weapons and experience of participation in violence in Ukraine and other post-Soviet states. As a result of their involvement in the crucial Euromaidan violence that led to the overthrow of the Yanukovych government, the far right after the Euromaidan radically increased their influence in Ukrainian politics. The far right members became integrated in the Ukrainian government, the police, the military, and the security services, took active part in starting and waging the civil war in the Donbass. The far right organizations' leaders and members are treated as mainstream by the Ukrainian government and the media. Who among the far right are the key players in the post-Maidan climate? The group that has garnered the greatest notoriety is none other than the Azov Battalion, an amalgam of street thugs who rose to prominence with the powerful patronage of Arsen Avakov, the Interior Minister of Ukraine since 2014. In 2021, Azov is anything but a loosely federated gang. Its leader, Andriy Beletsky, served a full term in the Ukrainian parliament and holds considerable political power in the country. Though it debuted as a paramilitary unit designed to fight in the war in Donbass, the group has grown into a national political movement. Its military wing is now formally incorporated into the National Guard, enjoying substantial access to state resources. Its political front, the National Corps, has active branches in every Ukrainian province. Azov, which has been accused by various NGOs of perpetrating innumerable human rights violations, runs multiple youth outreach programs where it offers children of all ages both ideological and physical conditioning courses. The Youth Corps, the Azovets Summer Camp, and an array of other programs are all geared towards drawing in young blood and socializing a new generation with patriotic values. Fortunately for Azov and friends, these community service initiatives are not dependent on the organization's coffers, but enjoy the backing of direct state funds under the thinly veiled guise of national patriotic education. Now that Azov is a formal component of the Ukrainian National Guard, it often attempts to run a clean operation, meaning it takes care to establish plausible deniability should anyone attempt to label it a white supremacist or even a neo-Nazi movement. Besides the laughably transparent use of neo-Nazi symbolism, Azov's connections to right-wing extremism are not difficult to trace. The recently opened First Nationalist Hub demonstrates not only the extent of Azov's resources, but its role in the far-right network of Ukraine. The hub was opened in the eastern city of Kharkiv in 2018, ostensibly as a community venue for cultural and political activities. The impressively well-equipped building often hosts public events ranging from English classes for children to knife combat tournaments for seasoned neo-Nazis. Azov utilizes the building in a remarkably adept manner, balancing the relatively harmless family days with intense mixed martial arts meetups frequented by fascists and war veterans. Should you attend one of these sports competitions, you would quickly notice that the hub's gym is adorned with flags and symbols from various far-right organizations. While such events are normally attended by the profoundly interconnected circles of Ukraine's extreme right, the possibility of encountering foreign participants is not negligible. Characteristically, the Western liberal establishment became significantly more concerned about Azov's network in Ukraine when it was discovered that right-wing radicals from all over the world were being attracted to the white supremacist havens Azov had built. Incidentally, the First Nationalist Hub is not the first building of its kind. Azov was running the Cossack House in Kyiv well before the hub's opening day. The strategy has always been perniciously effective. Centralize all of your projects in one space, where ex-military fascists can trade blows in the ring, across the hall from a student poetry contest. Azov and its many branches may be more or less at the center of the spider's web, but they are far from the only active and noteworthy organizations in Ukraine. One of Azov's contemporaries is the Right Sector, which similarly comes from humble beginnings. Much like Azov, the Right Sector rose to power around the time the Ukrainian Interior Minister pushed forward the formation of anti-terrorist units, in response to escalating tensions in the Donbass region. While the Right Sector has no ornate hubs or youth wings, it is present in every Ukrainian province. As can be imagined, this presence is neither passive nor benign. The Right Sector's members have served on the front, oftentimes alongside Azov soldiers since the beginning of the war. At home, the organization has been accused of perpetuating political violence, something the right sector can get away with more easily than Azov or its direct affiliates. Standing apart from its older associates, the fascist organization Centuria reflects a much more clear-cut ideological approach. Centuria's website is clear in its goal to establish a new generation of militants that are ideologically driven and professionally trained. The organization has a refined aesthetic, clearly inspired by Italian fascism with its overt reference to Roman supremacy. Centuria has been entirely true to its word, staging regular training sessions for teenagers and young adults, all while maintaining a strong degree of political involvement. Even a cursory glance at any major far-right event reveals at least a handful of masked figures sporting Centuria's logo, often standing right below an Azov banner. The breadth and diversity of Ukraine's far-right encompasses not only the blatant neo-Nazis and fascists, but the ultranationalists as well. Tradition and Order represent precisely this tendency in Ukraine, posing as a nationalist political party with an Orthodox Christian twist. Tradition and Order is not as directly connected to the military as Azov, but it is nevertheless a prolific movement covering multiple locations across the country. In the typical fashion of the Ukrainian far-right, Tradition and Order members love to intimidate political opponents, harass minorities, and campaign for the most reactionary of principles. Despite stopping short of Nazism, it seems Tradition and Order did not escape the fashionable allure of forming a militant youth wing. The party's very own Legions of Order were described by its leader, Bogdan Khodorkovsky, as ideologically equipped soldiers in training. The weekly agenda for a young man in the Legions is apparently 6 days of rigorous training, including, naturally, theological lessons and psychological preparation. There are many groups, parties, organizations, and associations in Ukraine that could undeniably be classified as far-right. Many of them make a habit of denying their rampant human rights abuses in the war, or their tediously apparent evocation of fascist and neo-Nazi rhetoric. But these efforts are, in the best cases, half-hearted and procedural, acting only as an obligatory hand-wave to assuage onlookers. Just as the OUN before them were not simply nationalist revolutionaries, the fascists of present-day Ukraine are not simply soldiers fighting off foreign adversaries. It is no secret that since 2014, the far-right in Ukraine has enjoyed unprecedented political stature. Though fascist political parties like Svoboda have experienced a relative decline in their influence over parliamentary and executive bodies, the degree of integration, formally and otherwise, between mainstream politics and the far-right has only solidified in recent years. Azov's top officials regularly communicate with government authorities and politicians. When representatives of Azov's National Corps sat at a roundtable organized by the Institute of National Development think tank on March 10, 2021, it was their voices that advocated for uncompromising reintegration of the eastern provinces. Maxim Zhodin, the current head of the Central Staff of the National Corps, recommended taking the Baltic approach, in which pro-Russian citizens would be required to surrender any Russian documentation under threat of denaturalization. Azov and other dominant far-right organizations have been at the forefront of the recent escalation in anti-collaborationist legislation, calling for nothing short of a witch hunt on any individuals or groups perceived to be sympathetic to Russian interests. The militancy with which the far right has demanded political purges muddles the otherwise well-founded intent to investigate Russian interference in Ukrainian affairs. Not only have parties like Tradition and Order insisted on liquidating the resources and media outlets of collaborators, representatives of various fascist organizations have been directly responsible for violent attacks against opposition. This is not to say that elements of the pro-Russian opposition have not been complicit in exacerbating the hostile atmosphere. What concerns us here the most, however, is the power the far right commands both in formal channels and on the streets. Moving with impunity, fascist thugs are granted every opportunity to harass and assault anyone who they see as an enemy of the state. As is traditionally the case with fascist movements, enemies of the nation are abound. They range from alleged collaborators to members of the LGBTQ community. When a coalition of 10 fascist, neo-Nazi, and ultranationalist parties pushed forward their candidates for the public council at the Ministry of Veterans Affairs, their agenda was clear. Unprompted, they declared that LGBTQ veterans associations and Veterans for Cannabis were the ideological enemies of the right. Considering Tradition and Order had proudly announced that its members conducted a night raid of a gay bar in Kyiv not long before the coalition announcement, such campaign slogans were very much in keeping with the far-right's conspicuous public profile. The Ukrainian far-right enjoys an unusual opportunity in establishing its mythos. While most of its enemies are fictional at best and victims at worst, the far-right can point to the absolutely undeniable threat posed by Russia. Unlike other fascist movements, which have relied on conspiracies and disinformation, the Ukrainian far-right has the luxury of a real enemy, one that they can use to mobilize and radicalize the public. This is precisely what many groups, including Azov, have done. Indeed, as tensions on the border flare, it is powerful organizations like Azov which have made the first call to arms. Azov hosted a nationwide training and mobilization event on April 10, 2021. The event likely drew in thousands of participants from across the country. A general of the Ukrainian armed forces was in attendance as veterans and civilians alike ran through tactical, firearm, and medical drills. Azov has not been alone in these recent efforts. While Centuria's members attended the Azov training sessions, groups like Right Sector and Karpatska Sich called on the public to enlist in volunteer units, holding similar mobilization events to bolster their recruitment numbers. Even the possibility of a heightened military conflict with pro-Russian rebels acts as an invaluable legitimizing tool for the far right, who are frequently first in assuring the population that they will defend the country from invaders. Whether hostilities at the border turn to all-out war or not, organizations like Azov will benefit from the effects of a rallying cry. At best, the Ukrainian establishment has remained complacent to the threat of right-wing extremism. At worst, the nominally liberal ruling circles have facilitated the spread and consolidation of the far right. The fascists and neo-Nazis have enjoyed explicit and implicit support, with the most well-funded groups receiving direct support from oligarchs and politicians. Lesser-known organizations may not have agreements with the government to conduct national patriotic education for children, but they are nevertheless afforded relative legal impunity, which proves to be a powerful advantage for a movement that emphasizes intimidation tactics and simple thuggery to get its way. The establishment's commitment to wiping out the left and amplifying an increasingly nationalist mythos only aids the far right in positioning itself deeper in Ukraine's socio-political framework. With active paramilitary networks, connections to the armed forces and the government, youth camps, and community building centers, the Ukrainian far right represents the most successful amalgamation of ultranationalist, fascist, and neo-Nazi movements in the contemporary world. As Ukraine plunges deeper into instability, and as Ukrainians become increasingly deprived of truly liberatory exit options, the prospects of a fascist takeover move from possibility to inevitability.